Hello, this is the Civil Rights Section C Extension of Voting Rights lecture. We're going to hit Prioritize Standard Government Civics 46, and objectively, we're going to trace the extension of voting rights throughout the United States. Suffrage, which is the right to vote, has been extended in various stages in the United States. Just a quick sidebar, anytime someone asks you if you're in favor of suffrage, the answer is generally yes, you are in favor of suffrage, because it just means the right to vote. It doesn't mean you suffer, per se. As at the founding of the country, suffrage was actually reserved almost exclusively for adult white males that owned property. So if you weren't a white male and property, you can vote at the beginning of our country. By the mid-1800s, nearly all white males in every state had earned the right to vote, yet black men were still denied the ability to vote. But then the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870 that said the right to vote was extended to all adult males regardless of race. However, in spite of this constitutional guarantee, blacks were systematically prevented from voting for nearly another century. In 1848, in Seneca Falls, New York, was the first Women's Rights Convention, setting in motion the struggle for women's suffrage. In 1869, Wyoming actually became the first state to grant women the right to vote, with other states following suit. So before there was actually an amendment giving women the right to vote, more than half of the states had already legalized it at the state level. The 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920, actually extended the right to vote to all adults regardless of sex. This was a part of the Progressive Era. You might remember that from U.S. history. Further limitations on voting were removed with the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act, 1924, and also the 23rd and 26th Amendments. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, this one officially gave Native Americans citizenship rights. Prior to this law in 1924, Native Americans were actually considered members of their own tribal governments and not actually American citizens. So in 1924, they officially got those citizenship rights also. The 23rd Amendment, which was ratified in 1961, added voters from the District of Columbia to the presidential electorate. So those that live in D.C., hey, you're allowed to vote for president. You can't vote for a member of Congress that can vote. You don't get a senator, but hey, you can vote for president. The 26th Amendment, which was ratified in 1971, lowered the minimum voting age to 18 years of age. So, hey, if you're a teenager, hey, you're good to go as long as you're 18. The efforts to lower this voting age actually began during the 1940s when World War II was going on. A lot of people were saying, hey, if you're old enough to fight, you should be old enough to vote. So this was passed again in 1971. While African Americans were granted the right to vote in 1870, many tactics were used to deny blacks from the right to vote in the South. While Georgia created the first poll tax in 1871, which required voters to pay a tax to vote, every other former Confederate state had created a poll tax by 1904. The poll tax excluded poor blacks from voting since most could not afford to pay it. Now, often, the poll tax would be cumulative, meaning that you had to pay for each year that they did not previously pay the tax. So if you were 21, you could have voted when you're 18, but you didn't do so, then hey, possibly you have to pay the poll tax for all those other years at the same time. And also, if you did not bring your proof of payment, your little receipt with you, you were actually forced to pay the tax prior to voting again. In 1882, South Carolina created the first literacy test, which required people to pass a test to vote. Literacy tests excluded blacks since they were routinely denied an education and therefore much more likely to be illiterate. Illiterate whites, however, did oppose the literacy test because it also barred them from voting, which led to the creation of grandfather clauses. First literacy test, I'm not sure how many boxes. It's like you'd be given multiple ballots, and you were supposed to put the ballot in the right ballot box, and they were labeled. So if you didn't know how to read, you wouldn't know which box to put your ballot in. If you didn't put in the right box, your vote didn't count. That was the original literacy test. They became much more absurdly just a way to keep blacks from voting. Grandfather clauses allowed a person to vote as long as his ancestors had voted prior to 1866. Since the 15th Amendment was passed after 1866, this actually allowed poor and illiterate whites to vote because their grandfathers probably voted. Even after the grandfather clauses were declared unconstitutional, I think that was in about the 1920s, whites often were excused from having to take a literacy test. And basically, even if they did take a literacy test, it was pretty much up to a white registrar to determine if you passed the test or not. So generally speaking, a white person would pass even if every one of their answers was incorrect. Black might fail even if all of their answers were correct because it was just up to some racist guy to determine if you could vote or not. It was not until the 1960s that African Americans were finally guaranteed an equal role in the electoral process. The 24th Amendment of 1964 officially banned poll taxes and any other types of taxes for that matter as a condition for voting in federal elections. It was not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the poll taxes were actually prohibited at the state level. So this just affected federal level, didn't actually affect the state level just yet. The Supreme Court finally declared poll taxes a violation of the Equal Protection Clause in 1966, though. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 officially prohibited literacy tests and put the entire registration process under federal control. So by taking voter registration out of the control of state governments, this removed states' ability to create obstacles to blacks voting. So it was not until this Voting Rights Act that the 15th Amendment truly guaranteed the right to vote would not be denied on account of race. All right, this concludes Civil Rights Section C, Extension of Voting Rights Lecture. Our prioritized standard again was Government Civics 46, and objectively now you can trace the extension of voting rights throughout the U.S.